So let's talk about, because you mentioned it, the vision that the Trump administration might have, what their approach is going to be. I take your point completely that the Israelis had their own motivations for needing to stop this war. The IDF has been stretched so thin. There's this controversy that could tear Israel apart about whether Orthodox Jews have to serve in the military. We had this civil war on the brink of civil war over the question of judicial independence prior to October 7th. Israel has enormous economic problems. At the same time, it does seem quite clear, given that all of this went on for 15 months without getting near a deal. Trump wins, has announced that he wants this done and over with before he takes office, and then suddenly, with the role of his envoy that he plucked out of New York real estate, Steve Witkoff, who was very aggressive by all accounts with Netanyahu and the Israelis, the deal is suddenly reached. What do you think is the vision? And I think there's nothing harder than predicting what Donald Trump's thinking about any particular subject at any given moment. But what do you think his motivation was in wanting a deal to be done that would end, for some period of time, the hostilities in Gaza?
Well, I think he wanted to come into the presidency with some sort of ceasefire in place in Gaza. And I think he has a deep-seated interest in perpetuating that ceasefire. It's not in America's national interest to see this war continue. And certainly from a moral point of view, it's not in our interest to see this conflict or this genocide continue. We have a deep-seated interest in shutting this one down, whether you're Joe Biden or Donald Trump. And he had an opportunity to do that, and he did it right before he moved into the White House. And this makes perfect sense from Trump's point of view. But the big question is whether he can work with the Israelis to maintain this ceasefire and then hopefully turn it into some sort of modus vivendi between the Palestinians on one side and the Israelis on the other.
One of the things, the accomplishments of which Trump seems proudest from his first administration was these Abraham Accords. Trump has a lot of admiration for Gulf state tyrants. They have a lot of money. There's a lot to do business with them. His son-in-law, Jared Kushner, has gotten very wealthy off Saudi sovereign funds and investments and the like. And Trump's vision of doing business with the Emiratis and the Qataris and the Jordanians and certainly the Saudis is very, very clear. And it's consistent with Trump's worldview. And I think the assumption is that that won't happen and can't happen unless there's some mitigation of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Certainly it can't happen while Israel is destroying all of Gaza and killing Palestinians in large numbers. On the other hand, you have an administration that is filled with some of the hardest core fanatics when it comes to Israel that the United States government has ever had, including people who share the view of the most right-wing extremists in Israel that the West Bank and Gaza belong to Israel biblically through religious dictate of God that has contradicted the position of both administrations, both parties for decades about the West Bank. How do you see those two kind of poles or pressure points being reconciled? That on the one hand, you have these hardcore Israel fanatics, they want to go to war with Iran, they want to destroy the Palestinians. On the other hand, Trump prides himself on avoiding war, wants a kind of peace that integrates the Gulf state and normalizes relations with Israel. Do you have any idea of how that's going to play out?
There's no question that there is a huge tension here. And I think it's especially true with regard to Iran, because all these superhawks in the United States and the Israelis themselves are deeply interested in pounding Iran and destroying its nuclear infrastructure. But Trump has made it clear that the last thing he wants is another war. And it's hard to believe he would have any enthusiasm for a war against Iran. And you would think he would be opposed to it. The fact is, and this is good news, he's in charge. And therefore, I think it will take quite extreme circumstances to get him to go to war over Iran. I'm not saying it won't happen, but there is a real possibility that he will be able to prevent the war with Iran. He would prefer to use maximum economic pressure to get the Iranians to do what he wants them to do. I'm not sure that will succeed, but that doesn't necessarily mean we'll get a war, and let's hope we don't.
So I want to get back to the question of Iran in just a second, because it's such a crucial part of this puzzle. But on this question of Trump's foreign policy and the fact that he does very clearly seem to pride himself on avoiding wars, it kind of comes out of the same Manhattan real estate world, where you threaten everybody, you threaten to destroy everybody, and it's all just a means of avoiding business destroying litigation and getting the best deal that you can possibly get. This is Trump's, identity and personality from long before he entered politics. So you have that impulse on the one hand, but then on the other you have him escalating his threats against Panama, saying, no, we are not just trying to get a better deal with Panama to pay lower rates for passage. We are going to take back the Panama Canal. There's the issue of Greenland, although I guess that's not really through military force, but the idea of buying Greenland against its will. Some of the threats toward Canada, which seemed more trolling. But the Panama question seems to be a kind of old-fashioned imperialist approach of, this is a weaker country, they have something that we want, and one way or the other we're going to take it. How does that get reconciled with this broader desire that I agree he has to avoid military conflict and war?
Well, I think he believes, and it's probably true, that taking the Panama Canal would not involve the employment of serious military force. It could be done rather simply. I'm not advocating he should do it. In fact, I think his rationale for doing it is nonsense. But anyway, he could do that relatively easily and relatively cheaply. Going to war against Iran, as you know, is a completely different matter.
We ask you about the dynamics surrounding the deal that was reached. We've seen since this ceasefire happened an obvious and potentially protracted escalation of the use of military force by Israel inside the West Bank. Miriam Adelson, who's one of Trump's largest donors, who spent over $100 million to help get him elected, has as the number one wish on her wish list the United States government's recognition of Israel's right to annex the West Bank. You have key people in the Trump administration, as we alluded to, like Elise Stefanik and Mike Huckabee, saying that the West Bank belongs to Israel by religious mandate. Do you think that part of the concession that Israel extracted, or the sort of benefit that the Trump negotiators offered, was if you end the war in Gaza, you can start the process of annexation in the West Bank?
I don't think so, in large part because I don't think there was any long-standing agreement that was reached between Trump on one side and the Israelis on the other regarding Gaza. I think what happens in Gaza is an open question. I think there's no question that Trump played a key role in getting Netanyahu to accept a ceasefire. But whether that ceasefire works out is open, as we were discussing before. There's an open question, as we were discussing before. So I don't think there was any long-standing deal, and therefore I don't think there were side payments at the time. I think that could happen over time. In other words, that Trump could put great pressure on Netanyahu to accept some sort of settlement in Gaza. He accepts it, but the quid pro quo is he's allowed to annex the West Bank and maybe all of the Golan Heights or something like that. I wouldn't be surprised if that happened.
Would that be an impediment to this broader normalization of integrating the Gulf state tyrants into a broader peace with Israel and normalization of the Middle East? If they're obviously incapable of doing that, even if they wanted to because of their population. But what about, and in terms of watching Gaza continue to be destroyed and Palestinian children killed every day, but what about the annexation of the West Bank? Is that something that could destabilize or impede the effort to normalize relations?
Well, the key country here is obviously Saudi Arabia. And what Trump would love to do is he'd like to, uh, have a Abraham Accord that involves Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the United States. And the Saudis have said that they will not agree to that until there is legitimate movement towards a Palestinian state, a viable Palestinian state. Whether or not the Saudis over the long term stick to their guns and insist on Israel creating or moving in a serious way to create a viable Palestinian state remains to be seen. I think it's quite clear that the Saudi elites don't have any special affection for the Palestinians and would probably sell them down the river if they could get a good deal in the process. The problem that the Saudi elites face is that there's huge pressure down below in the population to support the Palestinians. So that's why things are temporarily on hold. But I think the Trump administration thinks, and Netanyahu thinks, they can finesse this issue and come up with some rhetoric that vaguely promises a Palestinian state in the future. And that then is enough to satisfy the Saudi elites, and you get an Abraham Accord. But the problem is, Glenn, even if you get an Abraham Accord, it doesn't solve the problem with Hamas. It doesn't solve the problem with Hezbollah. It doesn't solve the problem in the West Bank. It doesn't solve the problem in Syria. And it doesn't solve the Iranian problem. And these are all enormous problems.
So let me ask about that. That's a perfect segue into to what I said I want to talk about with regard to Iran. In Davos this week, Fareed Zakaria, who is someone without whom I don't think Davos can even happen. He's sort of the embodiment of Davos in terms of the media. He interviewed the foreign minister of Iran, who is a very knowledgeable and respected diplomat, similar to Foreign Minister Lavrov in Russia. And Fareed Zakaria was insisting that he answer the question, or at least more so that he admit that Iran has been severely weakened by events over the last year. The fact that their air defenses have been compromised to whatever extent, the Israelis claim almost completely, but certainly to some extent through the Israeli retaliation. They've lost a key ally or proxy in Assad. Hezbollah has been decapitated with the killing of Nasrallah. Hamas is degraded. And he was saying clearly Iran is in the worst position, the weakest position that it's been in some time. And then you add on to that the economic distress that sanctions are in fact causing inside Iran. And the Iranian foreign minister was naturally reluctant to admit that. But what do you think about that question? Has Iran been severely weakened, perhaps more so than any time since the revolution, as a result of the events of the last year?
I think it has been weakened, but not in a really significant way. Losing Syria mattered. There's no question about that. And the Iranians admit that. And I think that Syria was very important because it was a conduit for shipping Iranian arms to Hezbollah. But what happens in the future in Syria and what role Iran plays in Syria remains to be seen. But putting that victory aside for the West and for Israel, Hezbollah is alive and well. The fact that Hezbollah was decapitated is not that big a deal. The Israelis have been decapitating Hezbollah leaders and Hamas leaders for a long time. They just get replaced. Hezbollah is a formidable fighting force. It will remain a formidable fighting force, and it will eventually be fully rearmed. As I said before, Hamas is alive and well. Plus, they're now dealing with the Houthis, who are another group of people who are heavily dependent and working with the Iranians. So I think, the Iranians, in terms of their allies in the region, are a bit set back because of Syria, but it is not that big a deal. And with regard to the argument that Israel has destroyed all of Iran's defenses, air defenses, and they now have an open shot at the military installations and the oil installations, I don't believe that. I don't think the Israelis did that much damage to Iran's defenses. But even if they had, I think that taking out Iran's nuclear capabilities is not feasible for the Israelis by themselves. They need the Americans, and it's not clear that even with the Americans that they can do it. So the idea that Iran is this big fat target now, and they can easily go in there and put an end to things with regard to the nuclear program, or even with regard to the oil infrastructure, I think is wrong. And then finally, if I'm playing Iran's hand and the Israelis and the Americans come in and they tear apart my nuclear installations and they tear apart my oil installations, what I do is I not only build a nuclear weapon, but I take that large ballistic missile force and I use it to destroy oil facilities in the Persian Gulf. And I would tell the West that not only is the Iranian economy going to be destroyed as a result of your action, but we're going to wreck the international economy by cutting off the flow of oil in large part from the Persian Gulf region. The Iranians have cards to play here, and you don't want to underestimate that. So we may get rough, and the Israelis may get rough with the Iranians from a military point of view, but you want to think about what their second strike capability looks like.
So in part, that was the answer that Fareed Zakaria got, which was, sort of a historical lesson that in 1982, when the IDF marched through Lebanon and all the way to Beirut, the argument then was, and eventually Arafat was exiled to Tunisia, that, oh, look, the Palestinian resistance is dead, Hezbollah has been severely weakened, or, the resistance insofar it was based in Lebanon. And his point was, the resistance is always going to be there as long as the occupation is going to be there. There's never a way to get rid of the resistance to Israeli occupation without getting rid of the occupation itself. And I think that makes a great deal of sense. But on the question of Iran, you said that if the Israelis or the Americans attempted to try and bomb the nuclear facilities, what you would do if you were them was say, okay, now I'm going to create a nuclear bomb. I think that on some level, it seems rational for the Iranians to be thinking about that now, for the very obvious reasons of the deterrence that it brings and the need for it. And there are reports, although there are always reports, so it's hard to know how reliable that they are, that the Iranians are now making more advances toward a nuclear weapon than they were making previously. It's something we've been hearing for 15 years from Netanyahu. They're weeks away. They're 2 months away. But do these events, this kind of, oh, Iran's so weak, we've taken away their air defenses, they're a big fat target, does that increase the motivation for the Iranians to now want to get nuclear weapons? Or on the other hand, do the Iranians want to create the perception that that's happening to give them more leverage to get out of the suffocating economic sanctions that they are clearly suffering from?
Well, I think everybody I know agrees that we are giving the Iranians greater incentive to acquire nuclear weapons. There's no question about that. And I think the Israelis secretly wish that the Iranians take another major step forward in that regard so that we then have an excuse to attack those nuclear facilities. But there's no question the Iranians would be better off having nuclear weapons. North Korea, for example, is better off having nuclear weapons than not having nuclear weapons. From an American point of view, that's not true. I want to be clear here. From an American point of view, we do not want Iran to have nuclear weapons. And that's certainly true from an Israeli point of view. But from an Iranian point of view, it makes eminently good sense to have nuclear weapons. I've often said in public that if I were the Iranian national security advisor over the past 20 years, Iran would have nuclear weapons today. Just no question about it. In my mind, they should have nuclear weapons from their point of view, not from our point of view or from Israel's point of view. But they have not gone down that road. And the question is, what's going to happen in the future? And we're betting that we can put great pressure on them. We can threaten them, and they won't go down the nuclear road. Or if they do go down the nuclear road, we will slam them, and that will be the end of their nuclear capability. This is delusional.
In times like these, uncertainty is the only certainty. From geopolitical risks like the ones we've seen in the Middle East and Ukraine, both of which risk destabilizing global markets, to the Fed's nonstop money printing, it's hard to feel secure about your financial future. Since 2020, the US dollar has lost 24% of its buying power, and with inflation rising and government debt ballooning, your hard-earned savings are at risk. That's why I trust Lear Capital to help me understand the benefits of gold and silver that are physical assets that hold their value in turbulent times. Lear has educated me and many others on how to diversify into gold that can give you control over your financial security. With their helpful guides, you can understand how to take possession of various high-value metals, store them safely, or roll over your IRA and 401k tax and penalty-free. It's easy to get started. Just call Lear Capital today at 800-920-8388 or visit LearGreenwald.com for your free wealth protection guide. They've got loads of reports to help you understand the current political and economic landscape that I really do recommend. And here's a special offer for my viewers. You get a $500 credit toward delivery, storage, or IRA fees with your qualifying purchase. Learn how you can protect your future. Call Lear today at 800-920-8388. That's 800-920-8388 or go to LearGreenwald.com. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.